Hello, Algebra 1 students. I hope you are all doing well. Today we're going to go ahead and start Module 2, which is factoring quadratics, specifically when a is equal to 1. A couple of things we have to remember is standard form. That's when ax squared plus bx plus c is written. A would be the term in front of the x squared, b is the term in front of the x, and then c is the number at the end that's a constant, it's by itself. So let's go ahead and write out those values. A is 1, b is 11, c is 28, and of course what you may have forgotten here, we have to also recall whatever a times c is, which is 1 times 28, which is 28. So what I need to do is figure out two numbers. These two numbers are very specific. They have to do two things. They have to add up to b, and when I multiply them, they have to give me whatever a times c is. So they have to multiply to a times c. So let's start off by figuring out what two numbers multiply to give me 28, which is a times c. So there's 1 and 28. There's 2 and 14. And then there's 4 and 7. Those are the three factors that when I multiply them together, I get 28. Now what we have to check is which one of these actually adds up to give me b, which is 11. So if I add these, 1 plus 28 is 29, 2 plus 14 is 16, and 4 plus 7 is 11. Because 4 plus 7 is 11, and it multiplies to give me 28, then those would be the two numbers I need to do my factors. So I would have x plus 4 and x plus 7. If you wanted, you could go through the work to do grouping, but of course when a is 1, you don't have to take those unnecessary steps. For number 2, when I work this problem, I'm going to use a chart method because I know that many Algebra 1 students are familiar with using this chart. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh your memory of what that looks like. First, start off by finding a, b, and c. 1, 2, and negative 35. And a times c is also negative 35. When I do my chart, I kind of disregard the sign on the a times c. I know it's negative, but in my chart, I'm going to just go ahead and leave it as positive 35 because I know what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add and subtract and do a little manipulating. So let's go ahead and see what two numbers multiply to give me AC. So what two numbers multiply to give me 35? There's 1 and 35, and there's 5 and 7. So specifically what I want from this chart is I want a number that's going to be this, 2. The value of b. So let's go ahead and start by adding these two terms and then subtracting them. So 1 plus 35 is 36. And then I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to go ahead and subtract big minus small. So 35 minus 1 is 34. And let's look here. 5 plus 7 is 12. And then 7 minus 5 is 2. So I noticed that I found the 2 that I needed. But what does it mean if I have a plus here and a minus here? Let's talk about that. So of course we realize if a is 1, I'm just going to have the x in those two places. Whenever my values fall in the positive column, what that means is that these two will have the same sign. When I say these two, I'm talking about these numbers right here because these are my two numbers. Same as I found the two numbers on number 1 were 4 and 7. The two numbers here are 5 and 7, but I just have to figure out how to manipulate the sign. Because this one fell in the negative column, what's going to happen is they're going to have two different signs. So one has a plus and one has a minus. In order to decide which number has the plus or minus, the 5 or the 7, we look at the value of b and notice that it's positive. Because b is positive, our largest number will be positive. And my smaller number will take the negative. So basically what happens here is your larger number takes the sign of b, whatever that sign may be. If it was positive, then the larger number would be positive. If b was negative, then the larger number would be negative. Okay. Moving on to number 3. When I look at this problem, what I'm going to do is go ahead and start off by finding a, b, and c. A is 1, b is -8, and c is 15. Again, what is a times c? It is also 15. So let's go ahead and try this using both methods and see what you prefer. Use the one you like. So if I'm using the traditional method, I'm just going to take a times c and see what multiplies to give me that. There's 1 and 15. There's 3 and 5. If I notice, I need this to add up to -8, but right now these two numbers both add up to be a positive number. So what I could do, if you remember your rules of multiplication, a negative times a negative is also a positive 15. And when I add them, I'll get -8. So therefore, I'll have x minus 3, x minus 5. If you're able to remember that or use that, then feel free. If not, let's go ahead and use the chart. Either way, as long as you get the right answer. 1 plus, 1 minus. So I'm thinking, what numbers add up or multiply actually to give me 15? So the numbers that multiply to give me 15 are 1 and 15 or 3 and 5. If I add those, I'll get 16. If I subtract them, I'll get 14. Add 3 and 5, I'll get 8. Subtract 3 and 5, and I will get 2. So I notice that I have an 8 right here. It is -8 for b, but if you remember the rules of what I told you earlier, for my chart, if it's in the positive column, it takes the sign. They'll have the same signs. They'll have the same signs, whatever the sign of b is. B is negative. And then I will use these two numbers, 3 and 5. That might be very handy if you struggle with your multiplication or your integers with positives and negatives. This last one here, it's very interesting. This is called a difference of squares, or it's a special case. So when I try to work out a difference of squares problem, I notice that I have a is 1, b is, there's not actually a b here because b would mean that there's an x behind it. There's no b. And then c is -36. So if I notice a couple of things, why is it called difference of squares? There's a subtraction sign there. And I can take the square root of each of these, meaning x times x is x squared, and 6 times 6 is 36. That's the key to my shortcut. X plus 6, x minus 6. Let me go ahead and explain that. X times x gives me x squared, and 6 times 6 would give me 36. But one has a plus and one has a minus because of the minus in the middle. If I wanted to work it out, I could say 1 and negative 36, 2 and negative 18, 3 and negative 12, 4 and negative 9, 6 and negative 6. I'd go through all that process of doing all the work, but then when it comes down to it, the 6 and the negative 6 are the two numbers that when I multiply them, I get negative 36, and when I add them, I'll get 0. Okay. All right, guys. Enjoy the rest of your week.